Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Introduction to Google Anthos. Before we begin, I'd like to just cover a few items regarding this webinar platform. At the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a handful of widgets, mainly the Q&A widget, which you can utilize to submit any questions you have throughout today's webinar session. For viewing purposes, you can also expand the viewing window by clicking on the icon found on the top right corner of the slide viewer. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. And lastly, do take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. Thank you. At this time, I'll turn it over to your presenters, Dan and Scott.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome, and I thank you for joining us. One thing I'm going to do during this presentation is I want to share my screen and kind of go through the slides, and I have some other material I want to show outside of the slides. So I think it might be easiest just to share the screen. So I'm going to do that now and then start the slideshow. So hang on a second. All right. Scott, are you seeing the slide deck?
It's coming up now. I see it.
All right. Fantastic. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And go to my next slide. So introduce ourselves. My name is Dan Lang, and I am a principal architect on the national team with a focus on cloud. I also have a background in Java development and architecture. And I'll let Scott introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Scott Morgan. I'm out of the Raleigh office. I'm kind of Dan's counterpart in the Southeast region. Same kind of background, J2E background, heavy into containers and Kubernetes and GKE.
All right. Thanks, Scott. So let's look at our agenda. So when we talk about intro to Anthos, what we're really going to focus on, there's a number of different pieces. We'll discuss what that is when we say the word Anthos, and that is Google's multi-cloud strategy. So we're going to give a quick overview on what is Anthos. And then we're going to talk about the Anthos Service Mesh, which I consider one of the major components. Again, from a developer/architect point of view, to me, it's one of the most important components. And then we'll talk about Anthos Service Mesh on GKE. We're going to do a demo. So we're going to have live code here. We're going to show you stuff. Hopefully everything works. And then we'll look at the dashboard pieces. So that's our rough agenda. And if you do have questions, you can go ahead and type them in, and Scott hopefully will field those if he's paying attention.
I'll try.
So what is Anthos? All right, Anthos is a number of different components. The major ones here, one of the big pieces, Anthos on-prem. So that's where I'm running GKE. So GKE is Google's Kubernetes in the cloud offering, right? So Anthos says, well, hey, we can run that offering anywhere. And one of the big spots or important places is on-prem, right? I have things I need to run on-prem for whatever reason, and I want to make that part of my Anthos deployment. And so we'll talk about that at a later webinar because that's an interesting concept topic. We have Anthos Config Management. What that allows me to do is I can basically check deployments, different configuration, Kubernetes deployments, configuration YAML files into a Git repo. And config management picks those up and applies those across. It could be, right, I could be running 50 clusters, and it'll apply those to all those clusters. It also does policy management. So if there's different policies I want to apply to these clusters, again, you throw in this Git repo, and it has a certain kind of structure to it. And that'll apply those policies to all the clusters. So that's really cool. In fact, I've actually used config management to do a form of GitOps. So there are ways you can say, I want these deployments and these clusters, and you can check that in, and it'll, boom, it's like a GitOps built right in, and it works great. Cloud Run, that's where I just want to run my service. I don't want to really worry about Kubernetes and everything. So just give me that. So that's again, I can run that on-prem in the cloud. And that allows me to run my services or my apps quite simply, but under the covers, it is running on GKE or Kubernetes. And then what we're going to delve down into is the Anthos Service Mesh is, why do I need it? What does it provide? And how does it work? So we'll get into that. And then one of the other pieces for Anthos is migrate. And what that is, hey, I got my legacy apps running here. Well, how do I containerize them? How do I deploy them? All right, so this is a tool that you can use to do that process. Anything else, Scott, that I might have missed?
No, that covers it.
Okay. So there are, again, when someone says Anthos, there are many pieces to it. So Anthos also runs on AWS, in Azure, of course, in GKE. So that is your multi-cloud strategy. But just remember, when someone says, hey, I'm using Anthos, the question is, well, what parts of Anthos are you using, or is it all? So let's talk about the Anthos Service Mesh. So to me, it's the heart of Anthos. That's, of course, arguable, but and it's based on Istio. So if you have heard of Istio or know how Istio works, then you're way ahead of the game here, because that's where it comes from. Google has been a major contributor to Istio, among others. And so that's the service mesh piece that we're talking about. And it does allow us to do some multi-cloud meshes. We're going to, at the end, if we have time, we're going to demo a multi-mesh service or multi-cluster service mesh. That'll kind of show you that capability. But again, remember, Anthos, the goal here is I want to manage all my clusters that might be running anywhere, on a single pane of glass. And that's what Anthos provides. Let's continue on with service mesh. So before we get into service mesh, we got to talk about microservices. All right, so we're deploying everything on our Kubernetes or GKE cluster, and we're taking our app, we want to break it into microservices. Well, what happens is you run into some issues that you have to handle, right? So all these services are out there. Well, how do you secure them? Well, you can write code in your app to do that, right? That's one way. Another issue is, well, how do I manage the traffic? I got things flying, services calling other services, as you can see from our kind of convoluted diagram here, right? How do I manage that? Well, what about failover? A service fails. Or what about surges? So I want to throttle, right? So I don't want to overwhelm my service. I'd rather have something else kind of throttle that incoming traffic so the service itself doesn't get overwhelmed and crashed. And then I just want to see what's happening, what's going on in my services. Again, if I had 10 services, 20 services out there running, whatever, maybe 50, well, who's calling whom, right? So this way I can see what's happening is a goal here. And just testing. So I build out a new service and I want to do some A/B, some canary testing, right? Well, I know you can do some of that with Kubernetes, but it's not that as fine-grained as we would like it. And we'll get into that. So what are the features of a service mesh? So most service meshes, and there's a number of them out there, right, provide this capability. So service discovery, how do I find those services? Again, Kubernetes kind of has this, right? But this kind of gets you more fine-grained control. Load balancing among services. Well, I mentioned earlier, what if I have two versions of a service and I could have each one can have any number of instances, and I want to load balance them from it, right? How do we do that? I want my service mesh to help me with that. Failure recovery. If something happens, I want the mesh to be able to help me handle that piece of it. Metrics, how are we doing? What's our performance look like? Monitoring, is anything down? Including tracing and logging. I mentioned A/B testing earlier. How do we do that? Canary rollouts. I want to roll out a new version and just send a small amount of traffic to it and see what happens. In fact, I can even do where I send the same traffic to two services, where the response comes from, let's say, our in-production service, and I want to see what the other service does or the next version that I roll out. You can actually send the same traffic to both and see how your service responds. I want to limit the rates, right? So I don't want to overwhelm my service or the cluster with lots of traffic. So can my mesh help me with that? And then access control, right? Well, I want to require a token. It's the JWT token to get in, right? Because we want to wire up OAuth, whatever the case may be. Help me do that in a way. And then authentication, right? Which is kind of access control. All right, how do we authenticate? And the question here is, or the proposal is, hey, let me do all this without having to modify my code. right? So that's the big play that Istio makes, or Anthos Service Mesh, is there's a lot of capability I can add to my cluster, to my mesh, to my services that I don't have to write. And we'll show some of that, what that looks like as we move on. Scott, anything else we missed here, Service Mesh features?
Nope, you got it. You got it.
All right. So Anthos Service Mesh, what is its architecture? Okay, so we can see here this diagram, and I think you guys can see my mouse. Here we have two services, Service A, Service B, right? Those can be anything, and later on we'll show you some live services. But each service is running in a container that's running in our cluster. So with Anthos Service Mesh, one of its major components is says, okay, I'm going to create a proxy or a sidecar within that container. So that container contains my service, which is an image, and then also contains another image, which is this proxy. So this proxy says, all right, well, I'm going to rewrite internally to that container his IP tables. So I'm going to intercept all incoming traffic. And that way I can do things with it. I'll turn around and give it to the service. When the service responds, I'm also going to intercept that traffic. And then I can do things with it in Synapse way. So as you can see, my service is blissfully unaware that that proxy is there. Right? He says, hey, I get traffic, I'm going to service it just like I would anywhere else. So in my case, I wrote my Spring Boot service, and I have my REST endpoint. And he does his thing. The proxy is sitting there and doing a lot of management. And we'll get into what all that is in a bit. And you can see, so every service will have this proxy, and that helps control everything. Now, how do we configure this proxy? How does the proxy know what to do? Well, that's where this the control plane, which really is it's another running pod in the cluster that we have that's controlling everything. So he has three major components, and we'll get into each one of those components. But the idea is here, he's talking to the proxies, and he's configuring those proxies. And those proxies, too, they're all written in, I think it was C, right, Scott? Do you remember correctly? And they're
the Envoy Proxy. Yep.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point, too. It's actually is an Envoy proxy. So if you look up Envoy, that's what Istio/Anthos Service Mesh is using. But they're very, very fast, very small, so they don't have a lot of impact performance-wise to your application. Because it's very important, right? Whatever we use, we want to keep that impact minimized. And the mesh also controls ingress, and it can control egress of traffic. So you can even go so far as monitoring. If my service is talking to a database, I can go through an egress to get to that database. That way my mesh is aware of it. It's able to monitor it, control it. Ingress, same thing. We run these gateways, and they control all the traffic coming in and routing of the traffic. So that's the overall architecture in a nutshell. So let's move on. So Scott mentioned earlier is the Envoy proxy. That's the actual component. When we say the word proxy here, that's what we're talking about. So that's the other image sitting in our container, the sidecar, if you will, if you're familiar with that pattern, that's intercepting all our traffic. So again, deployed as a sidecar, and he does a number of things. So the list that I have here, service discovery, right? So he's aware of all the other services in a mesh. So when service A says, hey, I need to talk to a service B, he just names that service. The proxy is actually routing the traffic to the correct service. The proxy is extracting information, right? It knows timing. It knows how fast your service turned around a request response. It knows how many times your service is being called. Right, so there's lots of information that proxy is aware of that he can use for telemetry. He can enforce policies. So I mentioned where I want to throttle the incoming traffic. All right, well, the proxy is part of that throttling process. And also routing, too. I'm going to show later on a demo where we route 90% of the traffic to one service, and then I create a version 2 of the service, and I route 2%, 1% of the traffic to it. So the proxy is doing that. I want to do a TLS termination, right? So again, right up to my container, I can have SSL communication, and the proxy handles it for it. I don't have to worry about it in my service, right? And that's in the container itself. Retries and failovers, again, all part of the proxy, right? He turns around, calls the service, for whatever reason it fails. Well, then he knows he maybe configure for retries. I'm going to try again in X number of milliseconds, and then if not, I can do a graceful failure. We talked about traffic splitting, right? So I want to move from one service to another where I can split traffic. And it's language agnostic. So my service A and B, even though I have, myself, I'm a Java background person, but that can be anything in there, that service, right? That can be a .NET Core service, that could be Python, doesn't matter. It's just endpoints that is exposing. And as long as you can run it in a cluster as a pod or as a container, you're good to go. So that's another important point. And for me, the coolest part is I don't have to write this stuff. I don't have to pollute my service with this code. I remember back in the day we had POJOs, plain old Java objects, right? And I didn't want to have infrastructure stuff in those objects. And that's where Spring came along and kind of helped with that. Anything else, Scott?
No, just another point on the retries and failovers. You might hear a term called circuit breaking when you're dealing with meshes, and it provides circuit breaking as well in the proxy layer. So, can't emphasize enough that this stuff's all handled for you behind the scenes. You don't have to include any libraries in your code. And makes unit testing and integration testing very, very straightforward and easy. So, pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, that brings up a good point, because one of the other service meshes I'm familiar with is, if you're familiar with the Netflix stack, that also is a nice mesh that I like. But you don't necessarily have to modify your code, but you have to include, right, if you look in your POM, or again, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, you still got to include a lot of libraries in your actual service to make that mesh function correctly. Where this, when we went from, because we started out with the Netflix stack, Service Mesh had that all built out, and then we said, well, let's take a look at Anthos Service Mesh, and that's when we said, ooh, well, I see the advantage here is, again, it's less impact to my code. All right, well, we beat that horse. So when we talk about the Anthos Service Mesh and how does it work, well, it creates a bunch of custom resource definitions, or CRDs, in Kubernetes. So what that is that's saying, I want to take Kubernetes and I want to add additional capabilities. So if you know what these are, it's simple. And here's some of the things that I'm going to show you today, right? So the gateway, that's incoming traffic, all right? That handles that. What do I do with that incoming traffic? The virtual service is a big component of this. The virtual service is, how do I route traffic, right? So when someone says, I want to go to service A, well, what's happening behind the scenes? And virtual service gives me a way to do that. So if you're familiar with a Kubernetes service, this takes it up to the next level where I can do a lot more with it. A destination rule is tied to a virtual service. That helps us. Virtual service kind of routes. Destination says, here's exactly where I'm going, right? What services are we hitting? The request authentication and authorization policy, those two pieces are, of course, for our security piece, right? So one is, hey, I'm going to request authentication. And the other one is, well, once I'm authenticated, what am I allowed to do? So that's those two pieces of it. And then service entry, that allows me to two things we use this for. One is, I mentioned earlier, I want to call a database from one of my services, and I want it tracked by the mesh. Well, I can use a service entry. Service entry is also used if I want to do a multi-cluster mesh. So I want to treat my mesh and have it run across multiple clusters, which is pretty cool. And we use that to say, well, if I'm going to call a service that lives in another mesh, you use a service entry to configure that a cross-cluster call. All right. So those are the pieces, and we'll show you what each one of those looks like. So back to the mesh, we talked about the proxy and what it does. Now we're looking at the control plane. So again, this Istio is a pod that gets deployed. It's out there in cluster, it's running, he's controlling all this stuff. And his job, the pilot, he has three pieces, this Istio D cluster. our Istio pod. So at one time, these were actually 3 separate pods. They rolled it back into one. So pilot, what does he do? So the pilot, he's in charge of talking and configuring the proxies. So he's going to make sure the Envoy proxies are up to date. They have the current configuration. He abstracts any platform-specific discovery mechanisms, right? So remember, you're on Kubernetes. And again, this Istio or Anthos Service Mesh can be used in other things besides just Kubernetes, but that's its main purpose. And anyways, so the pilot is abstracts that, right? I don't care that I'm running Kubernetes or not. I'm just an Envoy proxy. I need configuration. And the biggest example I just said is his interface to Kubernetes. So that's his job, right? So that's pilot. The Citadel, he's the security guy, hence his name. All right, so he provides all the security infrastructure, the authentication. Oh, another piece, and again, I think we've mentioned this before, is my traffic in between my services. Well, I want that all encrypted, right? If somehow my cluster is compromised and someone tries to eavesdrop on that traffic, well, if it's encrypted, there's not much they can do with it, right? And within reason. So anyway, Citadel allows me to do all the encryption between services. And it also enforces policies, right? I may say, hey, well, this service requires some type of authentication or in an authorization. And so he controls that. And then lastly, in our major pieces of our mesh, is we have the Galley. So the Galley is when I deploy my configuration files, that's the component that's reading those configuration files. He's also interfacing with the underlying system, in our case, Kubernetes, right? So he hooks into the Kubernetes API, and he's using that API for information. But that's his job. So you can see it's a pretty straight, right? So we have 3 components in our control plane, and then we have the Envoy proxy. And when we talk about the ingress and gateways, they too are actually using an Envoy proxy to do that. So there's really only 5 major components to the Anthos Service Mesh. So it's pretty, once you understand it, it's pretty straightforward. Scott, anything else we missed on our tour of Anthos Service Mesh?
No, you're going to get into the details in a few slides, so I think we're good.
All right. So let's talk about security. So in this semi-confusing slide, we talk about, well, my incoming request, I want that secured. I want to have a JWT token on that, right? So we configure the service mesh to say, hey, I require this. And we can see there's an ingress piece right here. Again, this is really, this ingress, it's running the Envoy proxy, right? He's configured to let certain traffic in, and he knows how to route it. And he's also going to say, well, I'm going to secure it. So even though I may have a SSL coming in from the outside or TLS coming from the outside, internally, I'm also securing this thing. So as he calls additional services, they get routed, that's all secured. So you can see that. Another piece of it, so that's egress too, same thing, right? So I can set up an egress, that's a proxy. Another thing the egress does that you can do, you can say, okay, anybody running in the service or in my mesh, right, that has the proxy, they cannot go outside the mesh unless they have an egress defined. So that gives you an added layer of security within your system, within the mesh. But one of the big things, though, is I want to monitor what's happening, what's going outside of my mesh with our service mesh. Anything else, Scott, that you can think of on security?
No, you'll get into the token passing along in your example, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely will. We'll get into when we talk about JWT, what that looks like. Yep. So let's talk about our demo. We're going to do a couple of things. So we're going to see Anthos Service Mesh in action. I'm going to show you. So one of the things I want to point out is you can say, well, why not just use Istio versus using the Anthos Service Mesh? Well, the Anthos Service Mesh buys you a lot of configuration and dashboarding that you don't get out of the box that you have to set up manually. And then even though you do set that up, then you start using things like Grafana and tools like that to view your service mesh. So again, I want to be able to see everything in that single pane of glass, right? Because I could have meshes running everywhere. And we'll show the dashboard, and then we'll talk about a multi-cluster mesh a little bit, which I'll come back to this slide and show you what's happening. So let's go back, and let me show you the dashboard. So I'm going to hop over here. So this is our Google Cloud dashboard. Let me zoom in a little bit. And on this page here, so this is your plain old cluster view in Kubernetes, and you can see I have 3 clusters running here. So main and private are our 2 clusters I'm going to talk about, and these clusters in the Anthos world could be anywhere, right? I could have them running on AWS, I can have them running on prem. In this case, yeah, I'm still both running in the cloud here in GKE, but that's the whole point of Anthos, is that single pane of glass that I can see all my clusters. So anyways, these are our 2 clusters, and what I'm going to do is I'll show you our workload real quick. So for this demonstration, we created, again, it's somewhat contrived, we created 3 services. So I have a cart service, a catalog service, and a pricing service. So this is our imaginary storefront. And you can see that I have 1 running in my remote service, and then 3 in my my remote cluster, and 3 of these in my main cluster. And I have 2 versions of catalog, which we'll demonstrate what that is later. So it's a simpler mesh, right? We just have 3 things. And if I say, well, I want to visualize that mesh. So this is another thing that Anthos gives you, right? So I go to my Anthos, and I go to my service mesh. And this is another dashboard. And this just shows all my services that are in my mesh. I'm going to narrow my focus to just a single namespace. So in Kubernetes, we have namespaces that say, all right, I want to deploy my stuff to this section of Kubernetes, and it kind of is walled off from the rest of it. Anyways, here, so you can see our 3 services running, and this tells me my request per second average, which we haven't been running a huge amount. I got an error rate. So in this case, what we did, I just sent bad JWT tokens to force an error rate to occur, and it shows our latency. And another cool thing is there's actually service level objectives you can set up. So I have some set up here showing me all green. I won't get into that, but that's all this information is coming from my Anthos Service Mesh, right? And I didn't modify my application, my services at all to provide this information. Let's look at a topology, because you say, well, I want to know who's calling what. So this, and I'll zoom out a little bit. This is our mesh. And let's go into, I'm going to move it around and make it a little easier to see. So as you can see here, oops, let me scroll down a little bit. So let me turn on some too. I'm going to do system services. Oh, yeah. I'm going to redo my graph. All right, so this is my topology. I can see all my services. So here's my ingress gateway. We talked about the service mesh has a gateway construct. It's really running one of those Envoy proxies. And then it's going to my cart service, right? So this is how I'm exposing my service. If we look at our little legend over here, I can see that's my service. Here's my actual pod, all right? So he's turning around and calling the catalog service, which is then routing to my catalog pods. And you can see I have 2 versions out there. In the catalogs, well, they turn around and talk to the pricing service, which in turn routes it to the actual implementation of our pod. So the cool thing here is I can see my entire service, or my entire mesh, in a nice and neat layout. I can see who's calling who, and you start seeing some information here of my queries per second. Right, so you can see details of what's going on, and then you can also click on the services, and I get some more information, like my error rates, my latency. So if you can imagine, you're running a complex mesh, right? This is really helps you out to visualize what's going on. and to me is huge. So I'm really quite the fan of the whole Anthos Service Mesh world here. All right, so that's our catalog. Now, what I want to do is, well, how do we implement this stuff? What does that look like? So let's hop over, and I'm going to show you. Let's start with let me go here. This is my catalog service deployment. So this is a straightforward Kubernetes deployment. You have a service and a deployment deployment, and then here's my actual, I won't get into what I was doing here, but here's my catalog service. So pretty straightforward. So now when we get into Istio, now we get into virtual service. So remember I said that Envoy Proxy has to be configured with something to know how to route data. So this is a custom resource definition, so an add-on to Kubernetes that allows me to do some routing. So here's the interesting part. So it says, hey, any traffic coming from these gateways. So this is a gateway I have defined. I'll show you that in a second. And this says mesh. Any traffic coming internally in the mesh, I want to accept that. Right? Anywhere else, we're not going to accept traffic. And then I want to start matching on. Go ahead.
Question for you, Dan. So mesh isn't defined anywhere that you've defined it. It's like a reserved word inside of Anthos that says any traffic within the mesh. Okay. Right.
Yep, that is correct. Because I want the internal traffic. And anyways, so I have a couple things going on here. We have a match. I'm sorry, if I see traffic come, because this says, all right, I'm going to route traffic that are looking for these hosts or these destinations. So that could be a lot of traffic, but I only care about traffic that matches these things here, right? So it's coming on this port, and it has an SNI host, which is a header piece of catalog. Or if this is our prefix, right? So if it matches one of these things, then I want to go ahead and we have a rewrite clause, and that's just to get rid of the initial slash. I want to shave off catalog and just put slash on there. So because the way the service was written. So all the stuff is done outside my service, right? He doesn't even know or care about it. And then here's the interesting part. Here's our route, right? Our destination. So I want to go to catalog, and I'm going to weight my traffic to send a very 1% more or less. And then 99% I want to send to my other version. So that's what we're doing right now. So I'm going to try and demo that real quick. So let's go ahead. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the logs from those two. Here's our destination rule, right? So I got two versions of catalog there. I got a version 1 and version 2. So let's go ahead. So these are my pods running in the server. And I'm going to stream the logs from catalog 1. And then I'm going to stream the logs from catalog 2. All right, so we got 2 sets of logs. And I'm going to go back to, I have Postman running. And I'm going to run this get all is going to call that catalog. So I'm just going to go ahead and send a few hits over. And let's go ahead and clear these logs. Let's see who's been running. Now, if I configure this correctly, catalog version 2 should be getting almost all the traffic. So again, hop over, and there it is. So this is the catalog 1 log, nothing. Catalog version 2, boom. Right, so this makes it real easy to change traffic. So if I want to change it back, so let's go 1 here and 99% here. Okay, now I'm not changing my deployments of the actual services or the services. Let me go to my terminal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to redeploy this guy. So remember, we just changed this from 99. So catalog 1. I want catalog 1 to get, or the original version, V1 of catalog, to get all the traffic, and V2 to get very little. So let's say we want to do a canary deploy. So, doing this live. You got to actually type them correctly. And it is giving me a validation error. And that's because the SNI host, for some reason, the current version that I'm running says that's not valid, but it is. It's very important to have in there. All right, so I just reconfigured, redeployed, right? My, let's make sure I'm in the right namespace. Yeah, we are in the right namespace. So let's try this again. So let's go back. Stream logs. Whoops, I already have my log streaming here. So we should see stuff in catalog v1. So I sent a bunch of messages. I'm going to hop back over. Nope, still only one in v2. Let me clear it again. I may have to restream the logs. Yep. I'm going to close these logs. I lost that connection. That is clear. And try it again. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but. And there we are. So catalog v2, right? No traffic. Catalog v1. Lots of traffic. Now, eventually, some will go through, right? Because we're saying that we're waiting of one, but so it'll let some through. So you can play with this, right? I just deployed a new version of catalog, and I only want a little bit of traffic to go to it, make sure it works fine. And again, we're doing some a little bit of canary testing there. Anything else, Scott, on version routing? You want to? I
just wanted to point out you use standard kube control to update and load those CRDs, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Nothing fancy there. I just applied these to my cluster inside this namespace where my services live, and again, I didn't touch other things. So that's routing, and let's take a look at. And I mentioned the gateway. So I'm just going to show what this looks like, right? So in every Istio configuration, we create a gateway and that the virtual service, right, used and said, hey, I only care about things coming from, and in this case it was the Istio gateway. So we're just saying, hey, we're going to allow traffic coming in on this port, and I'm going to give it the TLS mode, right? So we can set up TLS or HTTPS, SSL, that kind of thing. So that's what's happening here. So it's pretty straightforward. I got to have a gateway configured for my traffic to come into the mesh. So I'm not going to really do much with that, but I just want to show you what that file looks like. And that's another one of those custom resource definitions, right? Or add on to the Kubernetes. And yeah, another gateway. So you can configure more than one gateway if you need to. So let's hop over. The next thing I wanted to talk about is security. All right. So you remember I said right now, I'm going to hop over to Postman and show you. I am calling this thing with no authentication at all. If you guys are familiar with Postman, you can put in authentication headers. So all this does is just calls this endpoint, and I can see what I'm sending back. So I'm not doing anything really crazy here. I don't have an authentication. Everything works fine. So now I say, well, I want to authenticate that service. Okay, and I don't want to write something for the service. I don't want to have to redeploy the service. I just now want to have, I want to require authentication. And then I also want to authorize that service. So what these two pieces do, so these are a request authentication and authorization policy. So this just says, hey, I want to request if someone hits the service that we use some type of authentication. And there's a couple of things here. So we set up Google as our OAuth provider. That's what you see here. Another thing is I want to have any service that has this label on it, just require GWD true to require authentication. Okay, so that's what this required GWT, and I have it on both of these. So for whatever reason, you want services that don't need authentication, right? So you can do that, and if they don't have that label, they won't put it on there. So that's another cool thing, right? So you have all these labels label type capability of Kubernetes to say, I want this to apply to only certain services. And again, this is our policy. It says, well, if you're secure, right? If you've passed our, if you've been authenticated, we're going to allow you in, right? So that means we're going to get into the cluster. And I do have a rule here. So I'm looking at this claim. In our case, we have an email claim on that JWT token that comes in. And that is going to say, I'm looking for somebody within the jvmre.com namespace, right? So you have to have this email address to get in. And you can look at any part of the claim you want here. That's just what we did in this case. So this is cool, right? I just set up security. Now let's go ahead and deploy this. So let me go to my terminal again. And I'm in the right. And this is a plain old Kubernetes deploy like Scott mentioned earlier. Or make sure I go in the right namespace. And we create it because they didn't exist before. So what should happen is when I hit this button, and sometimes it takes a few moments, there it is. I am denied. I didn't change my service, right? I just deployed that to the mesh and told the mesh, hey man, we want to enforce these policies. So now I'm denied. So how do let's go ahead and request. So I have another one here with an authentication header. Let's go auth. I'm going to request a new token. So I already had this wired up. Right, in the real world, you were going against a web page or something to do all this, but I want to get the token. And let's send it. Oh. Oh, hang on. I'm going to go here. I'm going to put in a token. I was in the wrong one. And there she is. All right, so we got through. Again, this is the exact same call that I was just calling earlier. If I mess up the token, just show you. Right, can't do it. So it's got to be a valid token. If I go back to no auth, I'm denied. Pretty cool stuff. So that's how we handle, the mesh handles security. And so we talked about security. We talked about our gateway, the virtual service, right? All these things are surrounding mesh. Let me go back and talk about one last piece of the puzzle here. Whoop. I'm going to start there. Hang on a second. So the multi-cluster mesh. So this diagram is showing our two clusters. So I have my main cluster and remote cluster, and that's what I showed you earlier. And the cool thing is I have my cart service running in the remote cluster. Remember, we had the three services, the cart, catalog, and the pricing service. And then here I have my catalog and pricing service. So what happens is the client says, hey, I want to call the cart service. So it hits this ingress point, and he says, oh, you want to talk to the cart service? I know I have a service entry in my mesh. It gets routed to the service entry, which really routes us to the ingress to the remote cluster, because my service entry is configured to say, hey, this service lives somewhere else. And we hit this ingress here, and he says, oh, you want to talk to the cart service. So he routes it to the virtual service who knows exactly who we want to route to in the pod. So that goes to my cart service. Now the cart service says, hey, well, I want to call catalog, right? I'm done with my stuff. I need to call catalog to get some more information. So there's another service entry here that says, oh, that's in a different cluster. And again, these could be multiple clusters anywhere. And that says, all right, I know to route to here. He says, oh, you're trying to talk to catalog service. So he routes it to the virtual service, who then in turn routes it to the actual service or to the actual pod that contains my catalog. And then in this case, catalog is talking to pricing. And then in turn, pricing is the actual pod here. So somewhat convoluted here, but it's pretty straightforward once you get to it. So the bottom line is, as long as I have the service entry in each one of my clusters where that service doesn't exist, I can easily route to the remote clusters. And in each cluster has its own complete service mesh, right? Has its own control plane. Everything is kind of self-contained. There are ways where you can have both clusters as part of the same control plane. I don't like that as much, because now if something goes down on one of the clusters, things get more complicated. So I like having each cluster having its own control plane and then having these service entries. So that's how that's working. So I can show you, let's show you the service entry for, so this is a catalog service entry. So I would deploy this in my remote cluster. So when the cart tries to call, or anybody tries to call the catalog service, right, they're going to try and hit this host. This service entry is going to know how to route it. And I'm not going into all the details here, but basically I have my endpoints that say, hey, here's the IP address of the remote cluster, right? And this could be, you could have a router in front of it and do fail over different things. But the bottom line is, this knows what cluster to go after. And there's some other rules in here that I have to add, but that's how you wire this up. So it works pretty well. If we go back to our, let me go back to our console and show you that once again. Where did I go? There you go. You can see this cart. This is a guy that was running on a different cluster altogether. But in this view, it does just show it as, this is my mesh, right? I may be crossing multiple clusters. Now in the future, I think what we're going to do is we'll actually be able to discern between what service is running in what cluster. Now I can see this in the table view. All right, pricing here. Actually, it's showing 2 clusters per cart, which isn't quite true, just because I have that service entry in one, not in the other. So the multi-cluster support is in beta, but it is coming along nicely. So that's another big thing, right? Is did I get over standard? Is get this dashboard, right? There's other tools to stand this up. Oh, and then speaking of dashboards, I want to show you a couple more things. Let's show tracing. One of the pieces, things that I like to do is be able to trace my service calls. So here's one. Here's a cart. Again, all these are different requests. And then I go into my trace list. I can see, here's when I call cart. Remember, cart calls catalog, it calls pricing. So I can see exactly what's going on from a performance point of view. That's one of our monitoring things. And then another cool thing is I can even show logs, right? So I can see all my logs that happen. So you can really follow a request through your system pretty easily. And this could be, and remember, we're crossing 2 different clusters here too, right? And I can see that, which is cool. And then here's all the different pieces of information.
Did you have to add anything to your code to support this tracing, Dan?
No, well, the only thing I had to do is make sure that tracing header is pushed on, right? So when cart calls catalog, the catalog service, I got to make sure he gets header information coming in. So there's a number of headers in tracing that are standardized, more or less, and I just have to make sure those get passed on. And that's the only thing you have to do. But you would have to do that in any tracing tool, right? I want those tracing headers to go from service to service to service. Okay. So that is I don't know if I want to call it a limitation, but something that I always had to do. So you can see we had tracing. Let's go back one more time. And again, the single pane of glass point of view. I'm going to go to my cluster workloads. And here's our various workloads. And we can see what cluster they're running in. And if you haven't seen the Google's console, I'm going to show you a little bit about it here. So here's my cart. I can drill down to here's my pod that's running. If you go to logs is cool. So logging, I'll go to my container logs. So this is cloud logging. which you can do a lot of slicing and dicing. I've used cloud logging. I've looked for things in cloud log where I set alerts. So a lot of capability here in the Anthos world. So again, these are all my logs from that. You can see I have some data going back and forth. We're calling, the car's calling a catalog, different logging things. So there's a very, very extensive logging tool in the Anthos / Google world. Let's go back, and I talked a little bit. Yeah, we did talk about monitoring. So we saw some, if you go back to the Anthos Service Mesh, here's your dashboard. Again, I have other clusters out here that aren't fully up and running. And you can see my config management. I have clusters I have turned on that just aren't running right now. So we're doing a lot of different things. But that's the service mesh in the nutshell. So Scott, do we have any questions coming up at all, or?
No questions so far.
All right.
Everyone feel free to post any questions you have.
Yeah. So let me go back to my slide deck here. How are we doing on time? Ooh, 11:52. And I'll go to the last slide. What's next? So a couple things that Insight offers is we do have an Anthos design workshop where we get into, hey, I want to use Anthos because I want multi-cloud or I want on-prem. Right? Help me figure out what that looks like. So that's that workshop. We have a strategy workshop. Says, all right, well, now I kind of know what I want to do. Let's build out a strategy for it. Or hey, let's get started. Let's write something. Let's do a POC. And that's what the Anthos Fast Start is. So we have these offerings if anyone is interested. Again, I think multi-cloud is becoming more and more important. We're seeing more and more customers going into a multi-cloud strategy. They don't want to be, well, there's a number of reasons for multi-cloud, right? I may have better pricing over one cloud than another, or I just want, for DR purposes, right, let me run in multiple clouds. So this lets you do that. The biggest thing I'm seeing right now, though, is on-prem. I want to run my clusters on-prem. I want that single pane of glass. I want to be able to set my policies, right? Because I got clusters all over on-prem that aren't necessarily being controlled, right? Other departments just stand up a cluster and go, and we don't really have any good governance over all that. And this really allows you that governance with that monitoring. So that's all I have for now. If we don't have any questions,
there's one question. Dan, there's one question just came in. So
yes.
The question is everything you showed part of the Anthos license, or are there other GC products needed?
No, that once you get the Anthos license, everything else is roughly included, right? I mean, there's other little things like if I'm deploying to a cloud or using up space for logs, but the big chunk is the Anthos license.
Right. So if your pods need storage.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with the Anthos license, that's what gives you that single pane of glass. That's what gives you that service mesh that takes advantage of those of the Google consoles as opposed to standing up your own, right? Even if you deploy your Prometheus Grafana type stuff, well, you still got to have it stand up. And then what if you want to do multiple clusters? Well, that things start getting complicated, right? So as soon as you get past the simple single cluster world, that's when stuff starts getting a little hairy, and that's what this really helps you out with. All right, I think that's all we have for now. And I think there is a something to fill out at the end. We have a survey. So if you don't mind, fill it out. Let us know how we did. And I thank everyone for joining us.
All right, thanks, everyone.
That concludes today's webinar. A big thank you to the presentation team today and to the attendees. Thank you for the time and opportunity to come together. With that, we'll turn you back to your day. Thank you.